Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Weeb Union, and in this one we have very significant developments coming from all across the front line, except for the Donetsk section here near Pokrovsk and Toretsk. Everywhere else the Russians are advancing. The Russians have made some slight advances in the Kursk region and in the Sumi region in the northern section of the front line. They've managed to make 2 additional crossings across the Oskil River line in the northern section of the front line. The Russians significantly expanded their bridgehead across the Serbets River line. They also managed to advance north of Kamyansk in the Siversk section of the front line. They made gains here north of Ryorivka in the Bakhmut section of the front line. The Russians also had managed to advance here near Velika Novosilka, and they also managed to enter 2 additional settlements in the Zaporizhia section of the front line. Starting out in the Kursk region, we see that the Russians continue their advances along the border area, both within the Sumi and the Kursk regions, as they advance in the northern direction to align the front line near Basivka and advance further alongside towards Yunakivka. They are also flanking the Ukrainian positions within Guevo and Goronel, where they are attacking the flanks of these positions. The objective is to gain control over the border area and to encircle the remaining Ukrainian forces within the Kursk region. With this, the Russians continue their offensive operations to regain full control over the Kursk region and to start the offensive into the Sumi region. Zelensky claimed yesterday that the Russians were gathering forces for a new offensive into the Sumi region following the recapture of the Kursk region. And due to this, the Ukrainians have today started rotating significant amount of their elite forces to the Sumi region. And this is being felt in other sections of the front line, as the Russians have managed to make 2 additional crossings in the Oskil River line, gaining control over an area here north of Kamyanka and to the south of the town, where they are attempting to make additional crossings and to connect their forces from Tripoli in the north near the Russian border and all the way down south to the Varishna in the south. Their objective requires control over Kamyanka and Krasnopershi. This also indicates that the Russians continue their offensive operations and intensify them here despite the Ukrainian counterattacks in the area. The Russians also managed to advance across the Serbets River line, gaining control over areas here south of Makiivka, as they are here looking to also connect their forces in the Serbets River line with their forces all the way down south to Novolyubivka. The Russians also closed the gap between the northern and southern pincer maneuver, where they're pushing alongside the middle of the fortified positions. Russians here look to gain control over the fortified positions across the Serbets River line and to connect their forces in the east as they continue their offensive operations on the western bank of the river line. Their objective is moving directly towards Borova in the north, as the concentration of Ukrainian forces is larger in the Liman direction and it's well fortified and connected. Therefore, the Russians are here looking to bypass and isolate Borova from the Liman direction, and therefore to take advantage of where the Ukrainians are weaker, creating a secondary pocket similar to the one near Kupiansk. The Russians also managed to advance here north of Kamyansk, gaining control over some forest line positions north of the town as they advance towards the fortified positions of the Ukrainians in between the Russian side of the front line and the Siversk defensive lines. The offensive operations here is connected to the recent advances by the Russians near Belorivka and Verkhnoukamyansk as they continue the offensive operations following the capture of the town. The Russians also managed to advance north of Ryorivka, where they managed to gain control over several forest lines and fortified positions to the south of Oryhova-Vasilivka as they continue their advances in this section of the front line as well, to develop offensive operations along the canal and to improve their positions here north of Chesev Yar. This is connected to the Siversk section of the front line rather than the Chesev Yar one. In the southern section of the front line, the Russians managed to advance here north of Velika Novosilka in the direction of Vesele as they continue their offensive operations here to the northwest of Skutne and towards the final defensive line of the Ukrainians in the southwest of the Donetsk region. And the Russians also managed to advance here in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, gaining a foothold within Mali Sherbaki and also within the town of Stepove here to the west. That was a quick rundown of the frontline developments that have happened over the past 24 hours, and as we can see, the Russians have made significant advances across the front line from the Kursk region in the north to the Zaporizhia section of the front line in the south. If you take a closer look at the developments, the Russians have rotated forces for the offensive operation, which allowed them to regain full control over the Kursk region. The Russians took such few casualties that they were able to prepare for a new offensive into the Sumi region as well. This has forced the Ukrainians to relocate their forces because their own forces managed to get encircled and they took losses. Otherwise, it would not explain the need for the Ukrainians to relocate additional forces to the Sumi region and for the Russians to be able to launch an offensive into the Sumi region right after they completed their capture of the remaining parts of the Kursk region. This shows that the Russians have had a significant gain through this offensive. The fact that the Ukrainians are forced to relocate their forces to the Kursk region allows them to gain advantages in other sections of the front line, as the Ukrainians would be leaving up vulnerable positions because they simply do not have enough forces to deal with everything. The Russians currently are launching offensive operations in every single section of the front line where they have been, but they are intensifying them significantly now, and that is to take full advantage of their breakthrough in the Kursk region. If the Ukrainians relocate their forces from any of the other sections of the front line, they will leave a new gap, and the Russians will be able to take advantage of that to make significant gains, similar to at the start of the Ukrainian Kursk incursion. Each of these Russian offensives are separate, but they share a common goal, and that is to gain full control over the areas that the Russians have annexed. If you take a look at the northern section of the front line here near the Kharkiv region, we see that it is not an area which the Russians have annexed. So why do I say that this has an relation to the annexed Russian territories? That is due to the fact that Izium is an important town for a Russian capture of the Donetsk region. The reason for this is a Russian capture of Izium would significantly limit the supplies going in and out of the Sloviansk-Konstantinivka line from the northern direction, and with the fighting near Pokrovsk, it is also limited from the southern direction, and this would further weaken the Ukrainian positions within the Donetsk region. Therefore, a Russian bridgehead across the Oskil River line will allow them to launch offensive operations on the western bank of the Oskil River line, which will eventually lead to Izium. At the same time, the Russians already have the Kharkiv incursion, which can be connected with the forces across the Oskil River line, and this will allow the Russians to launch a larger scale offensive towards Izium, as they'll be able to have several supply lines across the border area and into the Kharkiv region, combined with their crossings across the Oskil River line and the gaps that would be present in Ukrainian defenses due to their lack of fortified positions across the Oskil River line. This will all play into the advantage of the Russians to potentially capture the town of Izium and limit the supplies into the Donetsk region. Across the Serbs River line, the objective here is to gain control of the eastern bank of the Oskil River line and also to start a siege of Liman as they continue their offensive operations across the Serbs River line, where we see with these several advances, the Russians are significantly improving their positions across the Serbs River line and their crossings. Connecting all of them will allow them to launch a large operations with more forces and therefore take full advantage of the numerical superiority and decrease the effectiveness of the natural barrier, which is the Serbs River line. In the Verkhnokremensk direction, combined with the area here north of Ryorivka, it is counted as the same section of the front line. That is due to the fact that there's the Severodonetsk river line here to the north, and then there's the canal here to the east. And as we take a look at this, it creates a pocket, and this pocket here I count as the same section of the front line, as the Russians here would not be looking to make several additional crosses across the canal. Instead, they have Chasiv Yar as a bridgehead. Instead, it would be offensive operations along the eastern bank of the canal and the southern bank of the Severodonetsk river line to encircle the Ukrainian forces within the Seversk section of the front line. Any offensive by the Russians north of the Severodonetsk river line towards Liman would allow them to cut off the northern connection, and with offensive operations along the canal to the south, they'll be able to cut off the western connection, and from that, Seversk and the entire agglomeration of towns and fortified positions in between the Severodonetsk river line and the canal would be completely encircled by the Russian forces, and therefore I count this area as the same section of the front line. With the Russian foothold within Vasyukivka, the advances near Sakoye-Vansetsi, the offensive operations near the north of Soledar, in the direction of Verkhnokremensk and Viemka, all of these are well connected as a singular front line to improve their positions and cut off the supply lines of the Ukrainians towards Seversk. However, the lack of advances in the northern bank of the river line forced the Russians to slow down here in the south. Now that the Russians have managed to make significant gains with the bridgehead across the Serbs river line, the capture of Ternia and Polivka, it is only a matter of time before the Russians start reaching Torske, Zarishne, and Liman, and that will cut off the northern connection. Therefore, the Russians are picking up the slack in the southern direction, moving along the canal. Near Velika Novosilka, the Russians here are not intensifying as much as other sections of the front line, but they are continuing their pressure. The objective is simply to advance along the fortified positions and gain control over the southwestern parts for further offensive operations into the Dnipropetrovsk region, where they can send their forces either to the Zaporizhia section of the front line or to the rear of Pokrovsk, in whichever case, or both of them, depending on the results on each of these front lines. The Russian forces here in the southwest would be able to support their forces in the south or in the east, depending on what is needed and what is reasonable. And in the Zaporizhia section of the front line, with the relocation of Russian forces to this area, they are looking to gain control over Sherbaki, Mali Sherbaki, Stepove, Lokove, potentially also Kamyanske, to align the front line with the fortified positions and the high ground of the Ukrainians. This will allow the Russians to create a better position for future offensive operations towards Oryhev and to apply pressure on the Ukrainian forces in the Zaporizhia section of the front line. As I mentioned, this would force the Ukrainians to keep their forces here in the southern section of the front line, and this raises the question, the elite forces that are being sent to the Sumi region, according to Western media, where do they come from? Were they ones who were in reserve in the Kiev or western section of Ukraine, or are they forces from other sections of the front line? In either case, the Ukrainian positions right now is very dire and very critical as the Russians launch general offensive operations across the entire section of the front line. Right now, what the Russians are doing is that they are intensifying the pressure, and as soon as they find a gap and make a breakthrough, they will dedicate their forces to that section of the front line, and we may see more offensive operations similar to the Kursk region, where the Russians managed to gain several hundred square kilometers of territory within a short amount of time, and the Ukrainian forces could end up encircled in other sections of the front line, further weakening their positions, and the Ukrainians could be entering a spiral that could end out of their control. However, as it is right now, nothing is decided. The Ukrainians can stop the spiral and solidify the front line, returning to a stalemate. However, in the current situation, they could also face a local collapse, several other areas similar to what we saw in the Kursk region. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.